course, right? So let's just, I guess, as an easy refresher, see if you guys remember what those topics are. So.
Provable security.
Yep, so that's one of them.
Protocols?
Yep, protocols is another.
Bitcoin or social blockchain.
So I guess okay, so like Bitcoin and blockchain, I guess, are a like kind of a special topic. I know I looked at the take-home exam you guys have, and it seems like you have a section on that there. I guess so. There's a possibility that you might also ask a question on that on the exam regarding that. But so I guess that might be something that's worth reviewing. But I wouldn't consider that like that's not necessarily one of the like larger overarching topics from the course. That's more kind of just like a fun additional topic. But then okay, so then on top of these two, the other big thing I guess that was kind of discussed in the second half of the class was. Yeah, so physical security, and then physical security has a cousin of sorts that it's also something that like isn't exactly about like the theory of crypto, but more kind of related to implementation, like things that might go wrong when you like implement some type of system, like something you might not expect that could be used against you, something like timing attacks or power analysis. Do you guys remember what the name for those kinds of stuff are? Side channels, yeah. Side channels. And then finally, as kind of the throwback from the first half, that's all just primitives. So primitives are things like, okay, so people yell out primitives for me. Yeah, so Diffie-Hellman, so that's an example of key exchange. What are some other ones? Come on, we definitely have more than one primitive.
The AES.
Yep, AES, so that's symmetric key. RSA, that's a public key. And then, so okay, so we have, right now we have a key distribution algorithm, we have symmetric key, and we have public key encryption. What other, there are two more types of primitives that we've learned about in class.
Hash function? DS.
Oh, I guess, okay, sorry. I guess technically there's three then. So yeah, there's hash function. So what's an example of a hash function, everyone? SHA. Yep. 6. And then, so there's two other types of primitives.
DS. DES.
DES, so DES is another example of a symmetric key primitive that's used for symmetric key encryption. Huh?
The rubbing.
Rabin is another example of a, I guess I can also write these, but so these are further examples of, so Rabin is another public key primitive, and then what was it, DES. But, so right now the stuff we have, right, so key distributions about exchanging secret material with each other. Public key encryption is about, being able to hide data where you don't necessarily need both parties to know the same secret. Symmetric encryption is about hiding data where both parties do know the same secret. So like most of this is about confidentiality. But then there are kind of these other two properties that we generally want in cryptography, right? So sometimes it's not just that we want it so that people don't know what we're exchanging, but we also we want to make sure they don't mess with our data. So what's that called?
Signature.
Non-malleability.
So there's non-malleability, and non-malleability is related to this idea called integrity.
Really good for HVAC?
So yeah, so MAC, so like HVAC is an example of a MAC, but message authentication codes is another important type of primitive. Those provide integrity, right? They prevent you from mauling your messages, which will help you avoid some types of attacks. And then finally, so I think I heard digital signature from this corner. So then what do digital signatures provide?
Repudiation. Non-repudiation.
So yeah, so that's definitely an important property. So non-repudiation is like the idea that like someone can't deny later on that they said something, right? But then I guess the other kind of related but slightly more important property is authenticity. It proves that the person who provided that signature is in fact who they say they are. So does anyone have an example of a digital signature scheme?
Imports? Lamport.
Yeah. Okay, I forget how that's spelled though.
LAMPRT.
MPORT. Yeah, and then like there's other ones like DES. You can have like technically RSA based. Most public key systems you can create a signature out of. Elgamal. No, Elgamal is a crypto. Well, it's a crypto scheme and it also has a signature variant to it. But yeah, so that's. So unless you guys have any other questions, that's pretty much all I really wanted to say about primitives, because obviously it's like the smallest piece for this exam, right? Like that, we really went into those in the midterm. Pretty much, I guess, the only other thing I'll probably say about crypto primitives is that keep in mind, like this is just like one of those things that always trips people up. The difference between MACs and signatures, right? MACs, message authentication codes, despite the name having the word authentication in it, MACs provide integrity. And an example of those are HMACs, and they are symmetric key primitive, whereas digital signatures are a public key primitive, and they provide authenticity, which is different, right? So authenticity is that it's verifying that you are who you say you are versus just saying that this message has not been messed with by someone. So that's just like, you know, an important thing to keep in mind. Let's see, so now let's talk about. Okay, so like improvable security, right? So first of all, does anyone want to just like give me like a like overview of like what do we mean by provable security?
That the encryption scheme, or that basically cracking the encryption scheme can be reduced to some very difficult problem.
Yeah, so that's an important aspect of provable security. So one of the big pieces of it is reductions. Reductions are the idea that the way that you kind of obtain the security for your system is by saying that you breaking that system gives you the ability to break some larger, more fundamental idea. So that, like for example, I guess a common cryptographic assumption is the existence of one-way functions. One-way functions are, you know, you have like some x and some f of x, and then this is easy, and this is hard. So very simple to go one way, hard to invert. Obviously, like this is a fairly important idea in crypto, right? Like most things that most primitives tend to kind of, in some sense, try to kind of emulate this idea of a one-way function. That you kind of want things that are very easy to go and simple to compute in one direction, but then not everyone can do the inversion. And these are something that are widely accepted to be real. Like that's a pretty important idea in crypto. So say if you create a scheme and then you make its security rest on one-way functions, right? The idea there is you're saying that if you could break my scheme, then you could break one-way functions, which would be very, very significant to the field, right? Because that means that like pretty much our like current understanding of like how we can derive security is flawed. So it would be a very big deal if this system was broken. So then that's a pretty good like badge of confidence on your scheme, right? Like it's not that like it's just going to break by some surprise, right? It's going to require a significant reimagining of kind of how the field works. And okay, so another important aspect of provable security are like kind of, you know, like there's different types of provable security, right? So there's information theoretic provable security, otherwise known as like perfect. Versus computational. So perfect provable security is the idea that no matter what resources you have, that your system will remain secure. That it doesn't matter if you have all of the time in the world, all of the storage capacity in the world. That's not going to help you. The scheme. That's why it's called information theoretic security. That the scheme gives away no information about the plain text. So a common example that you guys probably hear about, like at least once a week in class, I'm sure, is one-way or one-time pads, which are like kind of the canonical example of a system that has perfect security, right? Because once you encrypt it with the key material, every single plain text is equally likely to be the decryption of it. So no matter how much time you had, right, that doesn't get you any closer because this is just a probabilistic question right there. Versus computational, so the big issue with perfect secrecy is it's a very difficult bar to achieve. It requires a lot, and in many cases, it's an excessive, like it's an unnecessary level of security because if we can make it so that some security requires an attacker to expend so many resources, like so much time or so much money or energy, that it's just unlikely to happen for like a very like significant amount of time, right? Like if it's unlikely that your password will be broken by like an attacker for like a few like hundreds of thousands of years, right? It doesn't really matter that it can be broken in 100,000 years, but the fact that it's going to take that long, right? That's good enough. So that's the idea behind computational security, right? Where you rest more kind of on these more like concrete theoretical CS ideas of computability and like complexity theory. So you kind of try to make it so that in order to break your scheme, it requires performing problems that are considered to be, you know, like NP hard or, you know, worse, like an EXP and beyond, so that it's just not reasonable for like large key sizes to really be able to roll back the security of the scheme. Right? Okay. And then let me think what else I want to talk about. So the thing that provable security loves best is its security definitions, right? So you need kind of like, you can't really have security without some type of game. You want to kind of like, whenever you're trying to say that something is secure, you usually want to represent it kind of as a game that an adversary is trying to play and they want to win at. And your security comes from the idea that they would win with a very, very low probability. So we have a few pretty important games that are important to keep in mind. So most of these are related to encryption, but then one of these is related to both MACs and digital signatures, which is once again a way that it becomes very easy to confuse the two because they have a similar security notion. But so these are basically, you know, these are just like acronyms with hyphens that you guys have probably seen one time or another. So do you guys remember any of these? Yeah, so there's IND, CCA, there's one and IND, CCA2, right? So the difference between these two is, so this is indistinguishability under chosen ciphertext attacks. So the idea behind a lot of these security games is this idea of indistinguishability, right? How do you say something is secure? That say you take two messages and you encrypt them. If you can't really tell which, if it's an encryption of the first message or the second message, you don't really have anything better than say like the random guess, which gives you like a 50% chance of getting it right. Then you have a pretty good scheme. The adversary has no advantage. An advantage would be, say, if they were able to, you know, get past 50% significantly. So like most of the time, like, you know, like 9 out of 10 times they were able to, you know, correctly guess which message that was a ciphertext of, then that would be pretty bad. But so what IND CCA is about, it means that during this game, the adversary has access to both an encryption and decryption oracle, right? So basically, that means the adversary can, as much as it wants, see ciphertexts for the plain text it offers, and it can also see plain text for the ciphertext it offers. And the difference between the CCA1, which is called the lunchtime attack, and CCA2, the midnight attack, is that the thing about all these schemes, right, is you have, first you kind of have this, crap, this marker's dying. You have your like queries, right, where you can like send M1 to like some MN, and you can also send like C1 to some CN to like the oracles. And then you have your challenge phase where you send your M0, M1, and you get back. So it randomly selects a.
Hey, Alicia.
Oh. Yeah, if the black works out.
There's also an eraser on the cap if you want to use it like a pencil.
Oh, cool. Nice. Yeah, so. Let's see. So we got our challenge. And then we got our response. And then we send a guess. Right? So basically the difference between CCA1 and CCA2 is that in CCA1, after the challenge, you can't submit any more ciphertext challenges. Whereas in CCA2, even after the challenge, you can still send requests to the decryption oracle as long as they aren't any of the messages that you queried on earlier, because otherwise that would just be trivially simple. So then there's also so basically, in terms of the strength, how strong these security systems are for encryption, kind of the strictest one we have is IND-CCA2, and then IND-CCA1, and then the one that's weaker than those two is IND-CPA, which is indistinguishability under chosen plaintext attack. So in this situation, we are only able to, so it's similar except we don't have this decryption oracle, right? We can get as many messages as we want encrypted, and then we submit our challenge, but there is no decryption oracle. And the big thing to remember is kind of like the big flaw with the IND-CPA is it will consider a lot of crypto schemes to be secure, but then if those schemes still might be malleable. So the decryption oracle introduces an additional layer that kind of prevents schemes that have weaknesses with malleability from being considered secure. So that's like the important thing about those. And I guess, okay, so like just as an important example of like some provable security that you have done. So if you guys can like recall assignment 3, so that was the one with RSA, Rabin, and factoring, and all of that fun stuff. So what is the relationship between RSA and factoring in terms of, I guess, like security? So like, say we break RSA or we break factoring. What does that mean for each vice versa?
Euclid R?
No, it's not.
No. So the thing was with RSA, they are not equally hard. So obviously, if we can break factoring, then we can factor n, and then we can attack the RSA scheme. But it's actually an open problem right now of whether RSA, if it's broken, it actually gives us a way to factor numbers. We don't know if that's true or not. We know, like, so RSA is still considered a hard problem. We just don't know if it's as hard as factoring. But on the other hand, Rabin and factoring, what's the rule with them? Yeah, they're equivalent. So with them, similarly, if you break factoring, you can factor n, and then you can do whatever you want to Rabin. But then also with Rabin, the thing is that if you're able to, since Rabin kind of has this quirk where it has 4 different possible plaintext for decryption, right? You kind of have what you're like, they're generally like referred to as R, R minus, S, S minus. There's a quirk with Rabin, which is that if you're able to obtain both R and S, so like obviously if you got S minus, you could change that back to S pretty simply because it's just inverting it. But if you get both of those, then you can actually figure out one of the greatest common denominators, I think, of n. So then you can actually get moved towards being able to factor the number. So you can actually, so being able to break Rabin actually does allow you to break factoring. So that's why those are considered equivalent. But that brings to mind an important question, which is if Rabin actually is equivalent to factoring, which seems like a property that, given like provable security, makes it look a lot better than RSA, why do we not use Rabin and we only use RSA? I guess, okay, so the question is, do you think that, oh, okay, sorry, real quick, sorry, just before I forget. There's EUF CMA, which is the security definition for digital signatures and message authentication codes. The idea there, basically the underpinning of this is that you should, if you don't know the key, you shouldn't be able to forge either message authentication codes and or digital signatures. Okay, sorry for that.
So I've seen definitions for existential unforgeability and just unforgeability. Are they equivalent?
So that's mostly a bad case of people not being consistent. Generally, I think from my experience, if it's just like if they just did UFCMA, it's generally existential unforgeability. There's also selective unforgeability, but that's a fairly weaker definition. So generally, I don't think that's commonly used. Yeah, but okay, sorry. So switching gears back to Rabin. So the question is, why is that not something that's popularly used? So the question is, so is there one of these security definitions that Rabin does not fulfill? Like, is it not considered secure under any of these? Any thoughts?
Is it not secure under INDCCA2?
Yeah. So it's not secure under INDCCA2 because, think about it, INDCCA2 means that we have a decryption oracle. A decryption oracle basically works the same way as Rabin cracked did in the assignment, right? It's something that you can submit ciphertext to and get plain text back. And there's going to be a 25% chance that, like, given your ciphertext, you get the other value you need, and then you can factor n, and then bam, you've broken the security of the scheme. So yeah, that's the big thing about Rabin. It is equivalent to factoring, but unfortunately, it is not CCA2 secure.
Is RSA
But you can make it CCA2 secure by outputting with a specific one.
Yes, but then if you do that, you lose the equivalency.
Oh, right, true.
So yeah. So RSA with OE with the randomized padding, right? So RSA you never want to use by itself because it's you can barely consider it encryption by itself, right? Like you can do so many crazy things to it. You always want to use it with I think it's OAEP padding, and that once you do that, it is secure under these security definitions, and that's not so that's not a big deal, right? Because RSA was never equivalent to factoring in the first place, so adding this padding doesn't make us lose anything, right? It's just it's purely a gain if we add padding. We go from something that had like literally no security to something that then.
But without the padding, is it secure in those?
No, it's not because because it's so malleable, right? RSA, it's because when you're dealing with an RSA number, right, it's basically just a number to an exponent. So then all standard mathematical rules apply. You can multiply it, you can do whatever you want in that case, you can like exponentiate it and stuff. So that opens up a lot of fairly trivial attacks that make it not fulfill. Oh, okay.
Is Rabin CCA1 secure?
Is Rabin CCA1 secure? Yes, I think so. Because, yeah, so because CCA1 doesn't give, actually, no, sorry. It's also, no, you're right, sorry. It's also not, it's neither CCA1 or CCA2 secure. Any system which would allow there to be a decryption oracle would result in Rabin to break horribly. Okay, so I guess one last thing with provable security that's important to keep in mind is the random oracle model, right? So does anyone remember what's the purpose of the random oracle model? Okay, so the random oracle model, it kind of stems from this idea that, so in practice, we generally use a lot of things such as hash functions, where we kind of are using these primitives that we provide some input to, and we hope to get a predictable but random looking output. When I say predictable, I mean that on the same input, you get the same output, but that output always looks random. And that's generally kind of the idea behind hash functions. The problem being that hash functions are generally very, very complicated, and like they don't have that much in the way of formal security definitions backing them. So doing proofs on them is very, very difficult because they're just very hard to formalize. So the goal to like allow us to have some notion of provable security in the face of schemes that use things like hash functions, even symmetric key ciphers have the same issue, is we use something called the random oracle model, where we kind of, in our proofs, pretend that we actually have this thing that we give it inputs and it just gives us perfectly random outputs. But with the condition that if you gave it the same input, it would give you the same output again. So I think the example, like the kind of the metaphor that Matt likes to use is that you kind of have like a box with like an elf in it or a gnome. I forget if it's an elf or a gnome.
Elf.
Okay. And then he kind of just like has a little like notepad, right? So then he has like a notepad and a random number generator. When you like give him inputs, he if he hasn't seen it before, he generates that random number. He writes it down on his pad and he gives it to you. If he's seen it before on his notepad, he just gives you what the value on the notepad is. And the thing about this is, so then because this is just clearly something that's very secure, right? Because we're assuming it's perfectly random, it flows very neatly into this proof. And obviously there is a lot of discussion of whether this is like the best way of doing things, because then like you're making what some might argue is a fairly significant assumption of like, you know, assuming that we actually have these random oracles. But the thing is, like, that's already the way that we're treating our hash functions, right? We're already pretending that we're getting like what is unlikely to be predictable values out of these. So in that sense, it's not that far of a stretch to kind of do the proofs in this manner, because you're basically just treating the hash function the way, or like with the random oracle, the way that it is being assumed to be used in the real world. So, okay, so unless anyone has any questions, I'm about to move off from provable security. Sure.
Well, we need to know proofs. Just like there's like the, I think it's the Schnorr or something. Schnorr, like the Schnorr proof.
The Schnorr proof. I don't know the exact plan of what he's planning on putting on the exam, though I would be surprised if, I don't think he'd give you anything that you've, with stuff at like the proof level, I don't think he'd give you anything that you've never seen before, because proofs are fairly time consuming to do, right? So like, unless that's what you plan to be the only question on the exam, which I don't think is true. I doubt he'd actually give you guys like a fresh proof to do. What I could definitely see him doing is giving you the Schnorr proof, but maybe giving you like an invalid Schnorr proof and asking you like, why does this not make sense, right? So because what that does is you're not actually proving anything, but it still demonstrates that you understand like, you know, these ideas in provable security. So like the Schnorr proof, I think like one of the big things is it uses the random oracle, right, to kind of remove like the interactive step. Hopefully I'm not losing you guys. But basically like the idea is that in Schnorr you use this random oracle to like obtain a challenge so that the other party knows that you've produced your signature honestly.
How do you spell that?
The name, I think it's, okay, it's
ICH.
Oh.
So do you think the exam will be similar to the take-home final that he's given out?
No. I like you're not going to see similar problems probably. So if you see something on the take-home final, I guess it's arguably random whether it would be or not be similar to the exam. But I mean, so as far as I looked on the take-home final, it seemed to be a more general covering of the semester, where the first question was like about Merkle hashes. So that seems to, at least I haven't looked at it in too much detail, but that seems to be more where you'd like, you know, build off of your knowledge about primitives. Whereas, you know, as I said, this take-home or this in-class exam is going to be focused on the second half. So, okay, I guess that question might have some provable security ideas in it, but yeah, but I wouldn't say that there is any correlation. Like, you should approach those as two completely separate entities.
The take-home exam was supposed to be homework 4.
Yeah, and it's optional.
It counts towards assignments.
Yeah, it counts towards your assignment. So like, if you're not happy with your assignments average, then definitely recommend doing the take-home final. And obviously, like, it's a take-home, so and this isn't this isn't one of those classes where, you know, like, the professor really tries to make the take-home like intense. Like, you know, it's a reasonable assignment that, like, if you spend enough time, like, you should be able to like not have too much trouble with it. And of course, it doesn't involve coding, so that's always nice. Okay, so any other questions about provable security? Okay, so then let's talk about protocols.
Wait, actually, could
Oh.
you give an example of something that's not EUCMA secured? Or EUFCMA?
Sure. Okay, let me think. Okay, so just to refresh all of our memories. So this security looks like, basically the idea is that the adversary has access to a oracle that can produce signatures, right? So you can give a bunch of M's and then you get some signatures back. And the goal is that you have to be able to submit a message and a signature that has not been seen yet, that such that would verify signature star equals 1. So let's think.
I think all the known constructions are UCMA.
Huh?
All the known constructions are UCMA.
They are? Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm trying to think of like a contrived example that wouldn't be.
For example, if the verify only verifies the first 2 bits of the signature.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So then, yeah, if there's
Okay,
something
makes
clearly like that, then yeah, obviously it would be fairly trivial to come up with a signature that fulfills that. Because, okay. Yeah,
Thanks.
so.
Sorry.
Okay, so for protocols then. So pretty much, like, it's protocols with an S, but realistically there's a single one that really matters, which is TLS. Which of course is, so TLS is the backbone of like security on the internet. That's what we use to encrypt messages between our clients and our servers. And basically the important things to know about it are you want to make sure you are familiar with the handshake and like basically like not like obviously like any like it should be true like it's trivial. I'm sure all of you guys will actually just like write the handshake itself on your cheat sheets, but actually like be familiar with why they're like the steps are there, right? Like first, so there's I think 3 steps of challenge. So because basically the idea behind the handshake, right, is that you want to come to a key agreement between the 2 sides, and the way that you do that involves also like deciding on a cipher suite because you want to make sure obviously that you guys are using the same. You want to use the same functions, because otherwise how the heck is this going to work and stuff like that. So like be familiar with like why and like the purpose of each of the different steps of the handshake. And then also the other big thing is like TLS has like 50,000 trillion different attacks on it. You don't need to know all of them. You should definitely be familiar with a few, but it's important to recognize that most of these attacks have pretty similar traits to them. Like the 2 kind of recurring things you're going to see are, first of all, that one of the basically biggest issues with TLS, or just like SSL before it, and also is that back in like the 80s and 90s, there was this idea of export grade encryption, right? Basically, crypto was considered a munition, so it had to be weakened if you wanted to have it leave the country. And it was since it's weakened, right? It's no longer, it uses key sizes that are breakable, especially given today's computational abilities. So some of the big attacks on TLS involve, basically tricking one of the parties or forcing the parties to actually use these weaker export grade cipher suites, which then can, be broken. And then another very common thing is a version downgrade attack, where in newer versions, they've like removed these export cipher suites. So what's the strategy? You actually just force the server to downgrade to an older version of TLS that still had these export grade ciphers, and then you make it use the export grade ciphers. So those are like, so that's basically like, as you look at most of these, a lot of these different attacks on TLS, that's going to be a pretty common reoccurring trend you're going to see. And then the other thing I think that's important to talk about with protocols is that there are a couple more general attacks on protocols that are important to know. So I guess like these are just kind of like common strategies, right? So there is reflection attacks, where you kind of just send back what you get. There are man in the middle, which you guys should be very familiar with, where you have someone who's like, sitting in the middle of the protocol, pretending to be the other party, and then you can basically, and then you can maybe in that way get some secret information or circumvent the scheme in some way that people weren't expecting. For example, so Diffie-Hellman is a protocol which falls prey to man in the middle, right? Because it doesn't have authentication, so you can just stick yourself in the middle of it, and then pretend to be the other person, and then you get to have keys with both parties, so then you can see everything by decrypting the traffic as it passes through you. And then on top of that, there's also, let me think, there's additionally any other attacks that we should be mindful of. Oh, yeah, and then the other really important one is replay attacks, right? Where protocols generally have like characteristic transcripts, right? They have a set type, they have a set set of messages that they will exchange, and some protocols might not necessarily randomize them. They might not necessarily use nonces or timestamps or something that makes sure that the messages are fresh. And in those scenarios, you might be able to say you don't actually know any of the secret material, but you were just listening in on the connection and you saw some things going in some direction. Then if that protocol isn't careful about looking at freshness, right, you can just record those, send them back, and then you might also be able to say you listened in on someone doing some bank transaction, and it was a really, really crappy bank that doesn't know how to do security. If you listened in on those and you just replayed them, you could maybe be able to just replay that transaction. Maybe you won't get any money for it, but you could make the other guy go broke by just constantly making them pay out $100 to someone. So these are just kind of general attacks on protocols that pretty much a large slew of protocols fall prey to at least one of these types of attacks. So definitely be familiar with those. They might be useful because, as I said, I guess as you saw with the midterm, the thing about this in-class exam is you probably won't see the exact schemes you've seen in class. You're going to see slight variations of them, right? Because what math really wants to see is that you actually understand why things are happening the way they are. So he's going to make things happen the way they shouldn't, and see if you can catch why that's going to be bad. So definitely knowing these more general attacks will be important, because if he just kind of gives you some generic protocol, then chances are that it's probably either going to have some way that you can stick a man in the middle in it, or maybe you can replace some messages.
How is reflection different than random?
So reflection is basically more so so I don't have an exact example of a reflection attack off the top of my head, but so reflection attacks are more when you're say you're communicating with some party and you're just sending back whatever you receive. Yeah, I forget. I am blanking currently, but there are some protocols that is an issue for. That's not necessarily a good thing to allow. Sorry, I don't have the exact. I don't have exact examples of reflection attacks off the
So
top of my
if I
head.
was sitting in the middle and then you send them something.
But no, so the thing about reflection attack is the two parties are meant to be engaging, right? In the man in the middle, there's some additional guy who shouldn't be there, who's doing his own thing, and the man in the middle doesn't need to it's not reflecting back, right? The man in the middle is almost being an envoy. You have someone, you have Mallory, you have someone else. The message goes to Mallory, and Mallory forwards it on. Whereas in a reflection attack, it's more whatever gets sent this way gets sent back.
Gotcha.
Isn't it something resetting the server key? Never mind, I'm remembering wrong, but there was some attack that was supposed to force the server to reset or reject an established key or something and keep generating new ones. And then if you could figure out the seed of the random number generator, then you could attack it. Something like that.
Okay, yeah. That sounds like something that is a reflection attack. I don't want to give you the wrong notion because I am slightly rusty on them, but yeah, definitely keep those in mind, and I guess go back and review now that you have that term in your head, specific examples of that. But then yeah, so pretty much like that's so that like there's not too much with protocols. Like there's definitely going to be a question that's either on protocols or on PLS, just because like it's just such a ever-present concept in like practical cryptography. But there's honestly not too much to it, so it shouldn't be like it should be a fairly simple thing to review, and then you'd be pretty much well armed to like answer whatever questions might be related to it, because there's not too much there. But and then I guess the last thing I'd say about protocols is just like important thing to kind of know about, like whenever you're building any type of crypto scheme, generally the place where you're going to see all of the problems is going to be at the protocol level. Generally, the people who built the primitives did a pretty good job at making those, and generally the proofs are once again pretty solid. But the thing is the protocol level is really where you kind of start just grabbing a bunch of different things and combining them to build something that's more complex, and it also has like many more steps, right? Because generally with like most primitives are fairly atomic in that you provide an input and you get an output, whereas a protocol, requires multiple levels of engagement. Like you'll send a message, you probably get something back, and then you send another message, you get something else back. So every single one of those is another opportunity for something to go wrong. So protocols are generally where everything is going to go wrong, just because there's just so many opportunities for there to basically be information leaked or an adversary to insert himself. And additionally, primitives might seem fine by themselves, but then combined not necessarily offer strong security, right? So for example, with like this idea that we always talk about, or just because it's like a common thing to get confused, of like encrypting and then macking, or versus macking and then encrypting, right? One of those is significantly more secure than the other because it prevents malleability much better, right? If you encrypt and then you mac, then your ciphertext is also encompassed under the mac. So then the adversary doesn't really have any opportunity to do any type of messing with this with the message. So that's just like a kind of an example of like when you're combining primitives and stuff into these larger constructions, you have to be really careful, otherwise things are going to go wrong. Okay, and then we have physical security and side channels. So these are a bit different kind of than everything else we've done in that in several different ways. First way is that they involve a lot more hardware than a lot of this other stuff, right? So like physical security is when we're actually doing like hardware implementations of some of our like primitives and stuff like that. And the reason for that is because, first of all, hardware is a lot harder to reverse engineer, and then there's also other things with it where you can secure it not just, like you can secure it in kind of different ways, right? Beyond just like being like in a specific location. That like you can't like extract hardware remotely, right? Like you have to actually be there. And then you can add in these additional things like tamper resistance and tamper evidence, right? Where you can do things like a common example of like tamper evidence is you surround like your crypto processor in like a I think one example is like you've surrounded it in like a Faraday cage that basically, if you try to like cut through that to get to the crypto processor, like it's going to break some circuit that would then cause the contents of the crypto processor to be wiped. Or you can have some type of like fancy temperature sensor. So if they try heating up the processor, cooling it down, it will detect that and then clear the keys. And then there's like less extreme tamper, like there's less resistant tamper evident, where rather than just kind of like nuking everything, it just kind of realizes, reports that, oh, someone's trying to get into this scheme, but then generally for those schemes, they're recoverable. So you can still use them after the fact. You can probably like generate a new set of keys, or you could do something to get back to a working state. Whereas tamper resistant systems, generally the idea is that if someone's trying to attack it, it's just completely destroys itself so that there's no risk of attack. And then side channels can exist on the software level or the hardware level. The idea behind those is that they basically are not necessarily flaws with the program itself, the protocol itself, the primitives itself, but more so just kind of leveraging unexpected metadata about what you're trying to do. So like with things like timing attacks, right? Like the underlying primitive is secure. It's like, it's doing what it does. After it runs, it actually produced a ciphertext that's hard to break. But the problem is that in its running, it actually exposes information about the key material, and then that can be leveraged to attack the scheme. Similar in power analysis. And then there are also more hardware-related things. So there are things like cold boot attacks, which are kind of similar to what we discussed in the midterm, where, say, you have a system that, you have some type of encryption that the key is stored in RAM. What people can do is that when the computer's turned off, before that RAM is wiped, or because it takes a while for it to actually be completely just like all those electrons to kind of reset. So what you can do is you can just take that RAM out, throw it in some liquid nitrogen and freeze it, and then you basically buy yourself time to then analyze it and extract the RAM key, the key from RAM. So there's things like that in side channel attacks. Yeah, so that's probably as much as I have to say about for physical security and side channels. Yeah, I guess I think now I can open the floor to just general questions.
Yeah. Do you think there'll be anything about RFID and EasyPass thing you talked about? Because I know you have a personal project that you worked on. Do you think that'll be a topic?
That's okay. That's hard to say. So basically, for example, last year in his take-home midterm, he did have a question that was related to my course project for the class, but that was also for a take-home exam, and it's still it was focusing on the material from the course, just kind of using that as the backdrop. So I guess something like that is possible, where he'd frame the problem in the context of RFID. But the important things there is he might give you an RFID problem, but it's actually a protocol question, right? What it actually is it's some type of identification where you're sending messages back and forth, and maybe there's some type of replay where you could sit there with a sniffer, and then when I badge into my lab, you could get that message, and then you can come by later and replay that and get into the lab. So there's something like that I could definitely see.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I saw two questions on Piazza.
Sure.
There's the DEC protocol and there's DRM. Do you have any idea?
Sorry, what was the first one?
DEC. DECT.
DECT. I'm not familiar with that, but DRM is digital rights management. Did he talk about that in class? So so one of the common things that is done in crypto, which is probably fairly unpopular, is that most of these different media companies, right, don't want you to just be able to distribute your the music that you buy or the movies you have, the games you have willy-nilly. So they use encryption, where basically the idea is that you kind of have keys that. The difficult thing about digital rights management is they actually have to give you the key, because how else will you be able to access your data? But they do it in a really convoluted manner, so that it should be hopefully difficult for you to know that key material. But then it turns out most of these schemes, obviously, because the whole idea about them is just obfuscation, and also they're trying to obtain security against you on your own machine, they're generally not going to be the most effective schemes. He probably might have talked about some examples of those in class. I don't know specific ones he might have done. I know last year he talked about, for example, Xbox had a protection. I think the Xbox 360 had a protection that basically actually used timing, where what they realized was people were, I think, ripping stuff from between the Xbox and the TV. So what they ended up doing was they actually would have a timing check that if things were taking longer than they should have to go from Xbox to TV, then there's probably someone that's trying to record and extract this data. So then they would not send something. They would just shut that down. I know Sony has done a lot of different attempts at DRM that had varying levels of success. So I don't know exactly what he may have talked about in class, but the chances are that he may have talked about one one of those schemes and explain why it had like a pretty shitty or pretty crappy security like security mechanism. So that's something that he might discuss. Once again, he probably will. He probably do that once again, kind of as a framing for a question. Like once again, like protocol just seems like I really feel like you're going to get like a protocol question that's framed as something anywhere from some like recent event that's happened in the world or just some like maybe that's where your Bitcoin question comes with, where like some companies like giving an ICO that like that has like some amazing idea about like crypto kittens or whatever that people are talking about yesterday, but then like of course it like uses some crappy protocol that like is susceptible to like replay attacks that let you steal people's Ethereum or something like that. So yeah, so I feel like a lot of those like special topics and stuff like that are going to manifest more like that, or maybe as like a multiple choice question. Any other questions? You guys all ready for the exam? You guys all ready just to be done?
Yeah.
I feel you.
What is your opinion on CryptoKitties?
Somewhere between no opinion to like why do I not get money for the stupid things I come up with? Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it exists now. I mean, I guess.
How nice it must be to have that much discretionary time and income to be fooling around with CryptoKitties.
Yeah, I think it's a sign of the end times. It's all. This is the peak of civilization. It's all just gradual descent from here. Yeah. But then yeah, so I guess besides that, you guys should totally. I hope you guys had a good time in the class. You guys should definitely register for maths class next semester if you haven't, and take your applied crypto knowledge to the next level. And then also there's Abhishek Jain's cryptocurrency class, which will be pretty cool. It has probably, I think, like 500 people on the wait list. So like, I'm exaggerating, but it seems like last time I checked, it was like an inordinate amount. So maybe that's not a class that'd be as easy to get into. But it'll also, I guarantee you, like probably 60% of the class is going to drop within the first week. So like, it's going to be a cool class, but it's going to be somewhat cryptographically intense. But you guys.
You said it would be easy.
It'll be easy, but that doesn't mean it won't be intense.
Yeah.
It'll be easy to
It makes me sad that Matt and Bobby are offering courses